All right, so in the last lecture, we looked at all of the major arguments in favor of voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. So now we got to look at the opposite side of the coin. What are the major arguments against both of those actions? And the major arguments tend to take one of three forms. I have those listed here. Either they say, look, autonomy, well-being, and beneficence are important values that do support voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, but they're outweighed by other moral considerations, and we'll look at a few of what those other considerations might be. The second comes from Daniel Callahan, and he said, look, there's no way we can objectively measure suffering, and so we just sort of have to take patients' word on these things, but they're bad judges of it. It would be hard for any doctor to get an objective assessment, so we can never really get on board with saying objectively that someone's life is no longer worth living. And then finally, there are the arguments against legalization from bad consequences. And there's three different sort of bad consequence arguments, but those we'll look at in the next video. For now, we're just going to focus here on 1 and 2. So let's get into 1. So what are some other considerations outweighing our moral principles? One is to say, look, it's always morally wrong to take a life because death is always a harm for an individual. Therefore, voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are both morally impermissible because they're both versions of taking a life. Whether the doctor's taking the life or helping you take your own life, in both cases, a life is taken, and that always harms the individual whose life is taken. Some ways to motivate this are to appeal to the distinction between killing and letting die that we talked about in the last lecture. Right? So it's always wrong to take a life because that appeals to the wrongness of the act of killing. Letting die is not taking a life, it's just allowing a life to pass on. So that could explain why it's always morally wrong to take a life. There's also the doctrine of double effect, which says it's always wrong to intend to kill. So it's not the particular action that's morally wrong, it's the intention that comes along with it. Right? So in voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, the intention is to kill, and that's what makes them wrong. The action wouldn't be wrong if you could foresee the death, but you don't intend the death. So what could be an example of this? Well, a doctor could inject a patient with a very high dosage of painkillers, and they can foresee that this is likely to cause death, but they don't intend the death. What they do intend is to end the patient's suffering. Right, so the doctrine of double effect says we need to focus on that intention, and if death is just a foreseen consequence but not the one we intend, then the action is okay. But in voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, you intend to kill the person, and that's what makes it wrong. One thing that people have just sort of said in passing about the doctrine of double effect is it would be almost impossible to tell the difference in practice, right? So if we were to legalize euthanasia, not legalize euthanasia, if we were to allow acts that result in death, as long as we don't intend them, it would be impossible to tell in practice what the doctor's intention was, right? Did the doctor merely intend to relieve your suffering, or did they intend to kill you? So since that's impossible to tell in practice, it would be hard to sort of enforce the morality that's based in this doctrine of double effect. But that supports this premise 1 up here, right? Or this argument 1 up here. It's always morally wrong to take a life because death is always a harm, and that's because it's a form of intentional killing. So now there's a question, though, regarding this argument. The argument assumes death is always a harm. But is it true that death is always a harm? And imagine the worst life possible. That's going to be different for each of us, I'm assuming, because we all have different preferences and desires and things we dislike and like. But imagine whatever it is that makes life the worst it could possibly be for you. Would death still be a harm for you in those situations? It seems very unlikely, right? It seems that in the worst possible life you could imagine, death would actually be a benefit because the life would actually be a harm in those scenarios. I like to imagine some sort of third world country where I'm starving and diseased, so on and so forth. But we can add, in addition to all those things, I was abandoned by family, I have no sort of love or meaningful relationships, so on and so forth, right? Imagine the worst life you possibly could. It seems like that life, living that life, would be more of a harm than just giving it up. So this argument depends on this idea that death is always a harm, but that just doesn't seem true. Right? Death could be a benefit for some individuals. Another consideration against the principles of autonomy, well-being, and beneficence is that it's always morally wrong to take our own life for the life of another because it violates God's dominion over us. And so that's why VAE and PAS are morally impermissible. We're violating God's law in some sense. God intends us to die at a particular time. Suicide and euthanasia cause us to die sooner than God intended. So God has this plan, and we're sort of violating his plan, right? We have a duty to respect God's wishes. And so euthanasia and assisted suicide both violate God's wishes. Right? If he wanted you dead, you'd be dead, or something like that is the rough idea. Right? So John Hardwig, who you read The Duty to Die from this week, has three specific sort of responses to this idea that euthanasia and assisted suicide violate God's dominion. Let's look at those. So the first objection is that many religious people claim that active euthanasia is impermissible because it ends a life before God intends it, yet those same people still accept the moral permissibility of life-saving care. But Hardwig finds something strange in this reasoning, right? If we use life-saving care, doesn't that extend life longer than God intends it? Right, so if active euthanasia can end life before God intends, then life-saving medical care can clearly extend life longer than God intends. So Hardwig's saying, look, it seems we either violate God's intention in both directions or in neither. And since many of these religious people do not think we're violating God's intentions in using life-saving medical care, then it's got to be the same. We're not violating God's intentions in performing voluntary active euthanasia. The idea has got to be they either both rise or fall together by the same reasoning. Either they both violate God's intentions or neither does. The second objection says that, well, if God dies if everyone dies when God intends, then those who commit suicide or euthanasia also die exactly when God intends. And so many religious people who are using this type of argument claim that we're violating God's intentions. We're supposed to die when God intended us to die. Naturally, somehow, right? God intended us to die from cancer after 6 months of suffering, so that's when we're supposed to die, not 6 months earlier through euthanasia and suicide. But Hardwig says this just seems strange, right? If God intends us to die at a particular time, it really doesn't matter what the cause of that death is, right? Everyone will actually die exactly when God intends us to, and that's whether we've committed suicide or fallen ill naturally and die of a natural disease. Okay. And then finally, and this is, I think, Hardwig's sort of strongest response, is that, sure, God may want us to die at a particular time, but, and this is the important part, we shouldn't assume that God will always kill us at that time, right? So just because God intends us to die at a particular time or desires that we die at a particular time doesn't mean he's always going to make that happen for us. Instead, God might be worried, as many Christians and theists believe, God might be worried about our moral and spiritual development, right? Us becoming better people morally and spiritually, being developed and ready for the eternal bliss in heaven, right? Proving our worth to get there. And Hardwig says we have no reason to believe that the time of our deaths isn't just another one of those tests, another way of developing our character. So God may want us to actually realize that ending my life is the morally right thing to do, and he might want me to have the courage to actually go through with it. Right? So God might give you cancer and give you the option of euthanasia or assisted suicide, and then want you to be the one who's courageous enough to give up your worldly possession to move on to the afterlife, the spiritual realm. And so it's a way of God sort of testing your spiritual development. So euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide don't necessarily violate God's will or intentions or his dominion over us. They might, in fact, be an integral part of what God has planned for us. Okay, and then finally we'll look at what Daniel Callahan had to say against autonomy. So remember, the principle of autonomy says that we have this right to self-governance and self-determination, and that establishes a right to die, right? We get to determine as far as we can when and how we die. And Callahan says, look, this is an important value. I'm not arguing against that. But it just doesn't win in every circumstance, right? So think about rights. Are rights the type of thing that you can waive whenever you want to? Well, some seem like clearly that's the case. Your right to privacy, you can invite people into your home, you can set up webcams, you can walk out in public and start doing actions, and you have no right to privacy when you've waived it in those scenarios. Same with the right to an attorney. Right? You can waive your right to an attorney. You can represent yourself instead of having somebody provided for you or paying for somebody. But in certain cases, this sounds strange, right? Can we waive our right to life? Can we waive our right to be free from slavery? Callahan doesn't think so. Callahan thinks that such fundamental rights can never be waived. They can never be violated. So, for example, Callahan believes that we can never enter ourselves into slavery, even if that's what we truly desired, right? So we have this right to be free from slavery. Some think, yeah, I can waive that and enter myself into slavery as long as it's a consensual, contractual relationship. But Callahan says, no, that's not true. You can never actually waive that right. It's just fundamental to who you are as a being. It's fundamental to being human. So Callahan's claim is the right not to be killed is on par with that right to be free from slavery. You can never waive it. And if that's the case, then active euthanasia and assisted suicide would be morally impermissible, right? Because you can't waive your right to life. So euthanasia and suicide would always be morally wrong because you're violating your own right to life or requiring a doctor to violate your right to life, which would be impermissible. But I just want to highlight here for everyone that this is contentious among rights theorists. They disagree about whether or not all rights can be waived or not. So Robert Nozick, who's a sort of famous libertarian, anarchist thinker, believes that you can waive your rights, all of your rights. Everything can be done through consensual contractual behavior, so on and so forth. People like Callahan think you can't waive those rights. Okay, and then finally there's the measurement of suffering argument, which Callahan also gives. He just says we have no way of objectively measuring a person's pain, so we have to rely on their subjective judgment of when the suffering is unbearable. So when the patient claims their life is no longer worth living, in order for the doctor to put a stamp of approval on that and either assist in the suicide or commit the act of euthanasia, they have to agree. But how could the doctor agree? The doctor can't objectively measure their pain, so how could the doctor possibly determine the value of them continuing to live? So in other words, the doctor can't make the judgment necessary that they need to justify taking part in assisted suicide or euthanasia. But some respond to Callahan in the following way. Right? An objective measurement of pain really doesn't matter. What matters is our subjective preference, our subjective interpretation of the pain. So the doctor doesn't need to be the final arbiter. Instead, the individual is the final arbiter. They get to decide what's too much pain. And all that a doctor has to do is just see that it's possible for the patient to be in that much pain given the circumstances. And if so, then they can decide it's morally permissible to engage in assisted suicide or euthanasia. So that's it for the alternative arguments to the principles, and in the next video we'll look at all the different versions of the bad consequences argument. Thank you.